So welcome this evening to the MVS Pro Seminar Series at the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design. It's great to see a bunch of familiar faces in the audience this evening. As most of you know, we've switched the Pro Seminar of the Winter Series to be a little more public and also to follow a research trajectory. And this year's trajectory is on sovereignty and colonization. So it's great to see people kind of coming out to just more than one talk, and hopefully the series is asking a variety of questions from different viewpoints. And we've kind of seen maybe the questions kind of develop that way, so that's excellent for those repeat visits. Like I said, we've been doing about 4 or 5 lectures this term on the topic. We started with Maryam Jaffrey in partnership with the Blackwood Gallery at University of Toronto, Mississauga, really looking at decolonization in non-settler states around the world, particularly in Southeast Asia, the subcontinent, and Africa. Last month we had Kenneth Hopkins speak, an excellent talk on interventions and public art, particularly in critiquing the conquistador colonial violence in Central America. And then tonight we have Zoe Todd, who I'll introduce in a moment. And we kind of had an extra special kind of addition in the sense of Karen Kaplan speaking about colonial viewpoints last week and doing masterclass for students. So that fit nicely within this kind of topic this year as well. I want to just draw your attention to our last event in the series, which will be on April 6th. It's a keynote with the partnership of the AGO and After All Journal. So please keep that in your calendars. The night of April 5th, and then during the days on the 5th and 6th, we'll have some working groups, and then we'll end on April 6th with a conversation with Gerald McMaster and Charles Escher, the director of the Van Abbe Museum. So please keep that all in mind. I was also asked by the faculty to create a public reading list for this series. So you can find that was just released this last week on the Daniels website. So either check it out there in the recent news or on the Facebook event for this evening. It's also listed. A bunch of writers were included in that, including a few from our guest Zoe Todd, Kenneth Hopkins as well, Linda. Who else did we have in that group? We had basically Bonnie Devine. I don't know if she's here tonight. Her excellent essay by Linda Tuhai Smith on decolonizing methodology, as well as Lucy Lepard and Clarice Lispector. We also threw on a little bit in the last moment, kind of on social media. Of course, Wanda Nannybush and Carol von Zinnerberg, who were here last term speaking about art and colonies. So a lot of great writers that I kind of recommend, if you're interested in these issues, to read alongside the speakers as they speak this term. The evening's lecture is recorded, so if some of your colleagues couldn't make it, please let them know. We will post the lecture in a couple weeks online through the Daniels YouTube channel. Also posted kind of on the site and also on social media. Kenneth Hopkins was recorded and is posted already, so if you missed that one or you're just stepping into the whole series midterm, then please check that out as well. Her lecture's been recorded and posted. So it brings me to this evening's lecture and guest. I kind of want to open up by acknowledging the traditional territory of the Mississauga New Credit. I'll leave kind of a more focused or developed introduction to our guest tonight and continue the acknowledgement. Zoe Todd, it's a pleasure to introduce her. I just found out it's the first time she's speaking in Toronto, so it's always great when we can bring someone new to town that hasn't spoken before. She's Métis, and I'm going to read some of this because my language skills is quite atrocious. So I don't usually like reading, but it's very important for me to do this evening. So Zoe Todd, Métis, is from Amiskwachu, Waskayagan in Treaty 6 territory in Alberta, Canada. She writes on indigeneity, art, architecture, decolonization, and healing in urban contexts. She studies animal-human relations, colonialism, and environmental change in northern Canada. She's at Carleton University right now, as well as finishing her PhD in Scotland. In 2011, she was the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Scholar. As the bio kind of points out, she's perfect for the series. this year, but also just for the Pro seminar and the visual studies here at Daniels, which is a very interdisciplinary and political program. This series was actually supposed to be originally this year on post-animal or post-human or non-human intelligences, and we switched it on we felt was a more urgent and political issue, such as sovereignty and colonization. So it's kind of great when a talk like tonight, in a way, connects to this other research that's going on here in the issue of politics and animal-human relationships. So it's also, I want to kind of quickly point out that the first time I ever came across Zoe Todd's work was actually not in the academic environment, but a great polemic text she wrote on critiquing the Edmonton art scene. And it was this voice that had a certain courage and also the ability to critique kind of our assumptions and the way our institutions are done in the art world that really kind of made a mark on me. So when I started to reframe the seminar, I was asking people in Toronto who would they like to come speak on this issue, and one name continually popped up, and it was Zoe Todd. So that became an easy answer. You probably don't know this, but the last time I announced when you were here, there were actually cheers from the audience. So there are many people in town, I think, that are happy, as the audience kind of points out. I also know a lot of you require Zoe Todd's texts for your course. I know I do. There's two I'd like to point out just to kind of draw attention to, I think, the arc of her work, as I usually try to do in these introductions. The first was, and they're both available on the reading list, you can read online, an Indigenous feminist take on the ontological turn. Ontology is just another word for colonialism, and another one, indigenizing the Anthropocene. And I think both of those really kind of point to her critiquing the methodology of the academic language and the institutions. And so it's kind of with great anticipation. I also look forward to tomorrow's masterclass with our graduate students, as she's really kind of critiquing the peer review and the academic process and looking at other ways of being and looking that are more open to tenderness and care and relationality. So it's with that if you could please help me in welcoming Zoe Todd tonight.
Thank you, Tansei. It's really great to be here. I'm really grateful to be a guest here in the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation peoples, and also territory that's been home to many different nations over time. And I have to say, as a guest, I don't know enough about the history of this place, and so I come here with very little knowledge, and I want to be as respectful as possible. And something that I saw on Twitter today really made my heart sort of soar, and it was the work of, I hope I'm saying this right, and I hope the Anishinaabe peoples in the room will forgive a Métis trying to pronounce Anishinaabemowin, but Ogima Mikana has a beautiful piece about the dish with one spoon wampum, and what I really was struck in the short description of the piece and the beautiful what are those called? Those big ads on billboards. Thank you. So the billboard with the wampum, and just taking this from their Tumblr site, quote, "We have obligations of mutual care to each other and to the land that we share," end quote. And I think this sort of obligation of mutual care really drives a lot of the work that I'm inspired by in the world and the work that I'm seeing other people do. And so I'm very grateful to be here. As Métis peoples, we often find ourselves being guests in other people's territories, and we do have to tend to those relationships to other people's legal orders and other people's ways of working in the world. And so as someone who's also now working in unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory in Ottawa, I'm very excited to kind of just become a useful person in the academy and become someone who's accountable to those really deep and rich histories that animate and populate these spaces, and which challenge and shift sort of the colonial paradigms that have been animating things like architecture and art and anthropology and all sorts of pursuits for a very long time. So thank you so much for coming. I was kind of thinking before I started, there was a time when I was told by a professor that I wasn't grad school material. So it's amazing to be in a room and give a lecture at the University of Toronto Faculty of Architecture and sort of think like, sometimes we're bigger than the worlds that are sort of imagined for us. And I'm really grateful to be here and to get to tell you stories, and stories that are inspired by my relationships to my family and my relationships to Amiskwaciwâskahikan, which is where I'm from, and to get to share some of my family's history. And so it was really wonderful tonight to meet Kim and her partner, who are friends with my Auntie Loretta, and sort of that relationality and those kinship relations transcend geographies across the country. And so I feel grateful to sort of be here and share the ways that Loretta has shaped me as a person as well. So thank you. So tonight I'm going to talk about kind of an interrogation of my own relationships to home and to fish and to time and space and stories in Amiskwaciwâskahikan. And I'm also going to do this by bringing in stories and things that friends and interlocutors in Paulatuk taught me through my time working in that community in 2012, and sort of trying to understand how we can better sort of orient our relationships to one another and to place and time and more than human beings in cities like Edmonton, which have been so heavily marked by settler colonial realities over time. So with that, I will begin. So to speak of Edmonton is to speak a water truth. It is nestled along and spans the banks of the mighty North Saskatchewan River, a river which has carved its way deep into the soil and clay and sand and stone to yield steep banks that cut through Edmonton like an artery, supplying the city with water, with life. The river binds Edmonton to a broader watershed, and the clear mountain waters of the North Saskatchewan at its origins deep in the Rocky Mountains at the Columbia ice fields become turbid and inscrutable by the time they flow past the factories and sewage plants and homes and bridges of Amiskwaciwâskahikan. But upstream of Edmonton, 4 hours drive southwest of the city near Rocky Mountain House, you can still see the river running clear and with promise. So my great-grandfather, James Todd, was born along another stretch of the North Saskatchewan at Fort Pitt in 1881 or 1882. Nobody's quite sure. In a piece that I've submitted to Aboriginal Policy Studies at the invitation of my mentor and colleague, Chris Anderson, I note that when my great-grandfather retired some 70 years later from his career as a Métis farmer, he and his wife, Caroline Laframboise, lived in the Rossdale Flats in the core of Edmonton, the floodplains of the North Saskatchewan in what is now known as the Rossdale Flats, but was known and still should be known as Pehonan, the gathering place at the very heart of the city. But before I get into my fish stories that are going to animate most of this talk, I want to start with a few words about my grandfather, Nimosim, and his horses. So my grandpa, George, who died 11 years before I was born in northern Alberta at St. Paul des Métis settlement in 1912 and passed away in Edmonton in 1972. I can give you the address of where he lived. I can give you stories of his favorite restaurants. I can tell you the ways that he took my dad out for steak on Sunday evenings, and my dad insisted on fish and chips, much to my grandfather's chagrin. But I can't tell you very much in terms of how he was as a person because I never got to meet him. St. Paul, where he was born, is not directly along the North Saskatchewan River, but it is within its watershed. You could say my paternal family has been bound to the North Saskatchewan Sipi River for over 100 years. In between his birth and death, he lived a life that took him to lots of places, particularly construction and road sites, as he was a heavy machine operator by trade. Here are pictures of him during the war working for an American supervisor on the Alaska Highway. At one time, he was considering a move down to the States because the people he was working for liked him so much and thought he was such a good laborer. But obviously, things turned out differently because I'm still in Canada. And here's a picture of him walking down Jasper Ave later in life. So I only know my grandfather through stories, in the same way that I only know past Edmonton through stories, and I only know the waters and fish that were once healthy and abundant and flowing in my home territory through stories about once strident and teeming fish populations across the entire province. In my own life, I've been bound to fish. Fish have been my teachers. They have re-emerged in my studies from my early days as an aspiring writer in junior high, to my undergraduate studies in biology, to my doctorate in anthropology. But my grandpa Todd was animated and inspired by a different animal. And though he was bound to land animals, I feel a connection to his lifelong care and attentions to horses, which I see echoed in my own artistic, philosophical, and activist obligations and duties to, and passion for, fish. So before I begin, I want to tell you a short story about Nimosum and his horses. I want art that strikes to the very core of my heart. I want art that honors the dreams of Muslims like Nimosum, who had nowhere to show his work but on the walls of clapboard, creaking rental houses that he lived in. He drew dream horses right onto the spare walls of those prairie houses, on top of the paint, on top of the walls stuffed with newspaper, to insulate them against biting prairie cold. He dreamt of someday having land and horses of his own. He died, but those horses keep running wild in those houses, and you will never see them. I want art that is tender and caring towards those who aren't coming into your sterile white galleries. I want art that enters my veins and comes pouring out like fish, stories about the river and struggling against the current, carrying stories to you, for you to mull over and chew and swallow as you laugh and sing and dance and move unapologetically on your own terms. I want art that remembers that the stories we tell through it tie us to land and fish and dreams and past and present and future all at once. And I want art that is attentive and tender to the stories that are told even in forms illegible to funding agencies and academic analyses. I want art that builds up space for others. I want art that declares itself to be sister, cousin, auntie, and tease. I want art that remembers that it can manifest the otherwise and build things beyond our wildest imagination. I want art like those horses, running wild through those houses, galloping beyond pages you will never see. So this talk, at its core, is a meditation on urban Métis fish relations over time, and the way that philosophies and legal orders continue to live and animate people's relationships and duties and obligations to place, even in urban contexts. This talk is an intervention into imaginaries of cities as existing without responsibility to the waterways and the fish we share time and space with. And this talk is also a meditation on the ways that fish can be, and should be, centered in our discourses about what it means to live accountably, thoughtfully, and tenderly in unceded and unsurrendered Indigenous territories across the country today. So, to sort of orient you to my work, in 2014, I wrote an article based on my research in Paulatuk, which is an Inuvialuit hamlet of about 350 people in the Northwest Territories along the Beaufort coast. And in this piece, I examined how to place relationships, such as human-fish relationships, at the fore of conversations about things like reconciliation and Indigenous state relations in Canada. And so in it, I hypothesized a relational framework for Indigenous state reconciliation discourses in Canada today. And I argued that this framework expands, quote, Southern political philosophical horizons beyond the human and toward a broader societal acknowledgement of complex and dynamic relationships between people, fish, and the land in Paulatuk. So that's a lot of words to basically say that we have a duty to look at our relationships beyond our human relationships in place, but also the way that we interact and impact and shape the experiences and trajectories of animals and other more than human beings. So in this piece, I argued that we need to, quote, de-anthropocentrize our understandings of reconciliation. And I would say this applies as well to how we attend to the constituent and inherent tensions, problems, and flaws in the idea of reconciliation as it's being framed and practiced by the state. And I made this argument by drawing on teachings that Palatukmut, people in Paulatuk, such as the late elder Annie Alisiak, offered during my research in the community. In our conversations about decolonizing Canada in our classrooms and our city halls and our newspaper rooms and all the places that we're talking about what it is to be in Canada and to live effectively and with care in Canada, we have to remember to move beyond human politics and concerns and reintegrate what Papas Chase Cree scholar Dwayne Donald terms our ethical relationality to the world around us. So I want to take a minute right here to situate what I mean by Indigenous legal orders, because this is going to come up a lot in my talk. So in my own work, I draw on the scholarship of several Indigenous scholars who work at the crossroads of law, governance, and pedagogy. So Val Napoleon, John Burroughs, Duane Donald deeply inform my philosophical understandings of the world, as do the elders and interlocutors that I worked with in Polytech, like Andy Thrasher, Millie Thrasher, Edward and Mabel Rubin, and Annie Alisiak, as well as Andy and Millie's daughters, Sandra and Lenita Thrasher, my friend Herb Nakamayak and his parents, Jonah and Helen Nakamayak. So many people in Polytech took the time to take me out on the land and fish with me and show me the landscape around the community, and to, in a very caring and tender way, show me how the community asserts its own needs and its own legal orders in relation to complex and interconnected and very difficult colonial realities impacting northern communities like Polytech today. So in addition to these teachers, I also am deeply indebted to the artists, peers, thinkers, and friends I'm fortunate to know in Edmonton. So people like Dawn Marie Marchand, Tashina Makokis, my friend Cody Savard, all of the people who are working with the Brown, Black, and Fierce Collective. These are all people who are working at the intersections of art and politics and life and doing it in a really amazing way. So from Duane Donald, I've been oriented towards the notion of ethical relationality, an active principle that encourages us to tend not only to our relationships to one another as humans, but to our relationships to everything around us through time. And another person who's taught me so much is a Nuvialuk politician, broadcaster, and thinker, Rosemary Kuptana, who's deeply shaped my thinking about human-fish relations and decolonization in Canada. Rosemary taught me about what she calls the Inuit practice of principled pragmatism, which is, at least in my humble understanding, a practice of negotiating across simultaneous sameness and difference in order to contend with the paradoxes and twists and turns of colonialism and the colonial nation state over time. So Indigenous legal orders, very briefly, as Val Napoleon describes them, are law that is, quote, embedded in social, political, economic, and spiritual institutions. And she goes on to argue that law is basically a collaborative process, something that groups of people do together. Law is never static, but rather lives in each new context. In fact, one of the most important things to understand about any law is how it changes. And it has to change in order to be an effective part of governance. It has to be appropriate to the new context and circumstances, or it simply will not work. It also has to be appropriate to the experiences of the people, or it will have no meaning or legitimacy. And most importantly, she says, law is about thinking. So, taking all of these sort of teachings and paradigms and ideas to heart, I'm going to now talk a little bit about Polytech. And so, for the rest of this presentation, basically you're going to be subjected to my fish drawings. And that's how I'm going to communicate ideas to you. So this is an Arctic char, and it's drawn from a fish that I actually caught when I was fishing with Andy and Millie Thrasher. In June 2012, we went out on the Candle Ice, and we were fishing one afternoon after work. So in Polytech, I learned that fish exist and operate in pluralities. Now, John Burroughs is an Anishinaabe legal scholar, and he's argued that Canada needs to attend to the legal pluralities that exist in this place beyond just British and French common and civil law, but to the Indigenous legal orders that animate territories across the space and that people enact and use and apply every day. And so he's argued in the Globe and Mail and in other places that these legal pluralities can actually help Canada shift how it understands itself and apply different principles and practices to how we operate as a nation. And so this has deeply inspired me. And so this also helps to inform some of the things that came to light in my own work in Polytech, because I started to realize that fish are never just fish. They're many things all at once. So I learned that fish exist and operate in pluralities. In Polytech, fish are simultaneously food, sites of memory and stories, specimens for scientific study, non-human persons with agency, the fish that you catch, the fish that gets away. In this work, I call human-fish relations a microsite of engagement, and I borrow this idea of active sites of engagement from Arctic anthropologist Anne Feenip Reardon. And through these microsites, interlocutors in Paulatuk taught me that not only do fish bear witness to the colonial relations that humans experience and resist, but fish themselves are actively involved, paradoxically, in both fueling and resisting colonial incursions in northern Canada. I say paradoxically because through stories shared by people in Paulatuk and by consulting archival materials at Libraries and Archives Canada and the archives of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, I found that colonial agents relied very heavily on fish to sustain their missions and the Hudson's Bay Company posts as these colonial actors moved through Arctic landscapes in the early to mid 20th century. At the same time, however, as they were relying on these fish for sustenance, they didn't really know how to fish that well in the landscape, and so someone had to teach them. So in Paulatuk in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Inuvialuit were very consciously applying their own legal orders and principles of reciprocity, care, and competence in teaching the missionaries of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate how to move through the landscape. What's very funny is that in reading the codices of the Oblates that were stationed first at Leddy Harbor and then moved their way down to Paulatuk in 1936, they rely on this man, Assis Auna Lester, and his son-in-law, Douglas, to teach them how to fish in the landscape around Leddy Harbor. And so these men spend time showing these newly arrived missionaries how to move through the landscape. Of course, the missionaries have brought the wrong kind of net to catch the kind of fish that are there. They're just woefully underprepared. And at one point, they even, the missionaries resort to la pêche à la carabine, which someone translated for me. They actually resorted to using rifles to try and get fish. They were so desperate and so incompetent. So these Inuvialuit men in Leddy Harbor spent all this time showing them how to fish. But when they finally, the missionaries finally do catch fish, they don't thank their Inuvialuit teachers who've taught them how to move through the landscape and how to orient to the landscape. They thank the saint, the patron saint of the Mackenzie missions for providing them and provisioning them. And so it's interesting seeing this sort of blindness to the work and the labor of Indigenous men who've shown them how to move through this landscape and ensured that they could survive, and sort of how the missionaries assume the world to be moving in sort of through a Catholic understanding of miracles and so it's that tension between how we understand how the world works and whose labor counts and whose doesn't is constantly at the back of my mind because we see it happening all the time. So a crucial moment for me in understanding implicit duties to fish and fish pluralities was one day at lunch in August 2012 when my friend Millie Thrasher and I were eating in her kitchen. We were eating a lake trout, and she held up a fish bone and said, "Did you know that Inuvialuit have a story for every bone in the fish?" And I was really excited about this. I thought that was such an amazing kind of principle. But she gently explained that these stories aren't ones for me as an anthropologist to learn, which is absolutely true. Those are not stories for me to know. Those aren't stories for me to share. But the principle itself and the moment of realization where she taught me this deeply important part of Inuvialuit sort of relationships to fish shifted my understanding of fish as more than food. Fish carry stories in their bones, and her sharing of this reality, this truth, nudged me to think about the ways that fish in my own home territory carry stories within their bones as well. Not the same stories, not by any means. And I don't seek here to appropriate Inuvialuit praxis and philosophy, but rather I use this example to demonstrate how important it is to reflect on the ways that fish exist simultaneously as many different things and beings and agents in Métis legal orders in southern Canada as well. So just a few more Paulatuk fish, and then we'll move on to Alberta fish. So as I've indicated, human-fish relations were a microsite across which Inuvialuit asserted and negotiated a complex and paradoxical sameness and difference in attending to and contending with the imposition of state and church and commercial trade understandings of how to conceive of, move through, and relate to the lands, waters, atmospheres, and the human and more than human inhabitants and presences in the region. And this negotiation of fish pluralities and human-fish relations as microsites of resistance and refraction of colonial imperatives continues today. In other words, fish are an integral part of Indigenous legal orders, and we can and should think through our obligations to one another by also considering the duties and obligations we have to fish. So something I've been thinking about over the last year or so is just the realization that every single part of this place is a fish place. Alberta, which is traditionally thought of as a land place, is a fish place. The Arctic is a fish place. There are fish that live here in Toronto, and there were, incredible wealth of fish stocks all across North America. And so every place that we have duties and obligations to fish. But the way we build cities and the way we conceive of cities have largely erased those duties and obligations and have shifted our understanding of how we come to be in these places. And so just like the Oblates and the Hudson's Baymen in Cape Perry and Leddy Harbor in the 1920s and 1930s, the Hudson's Bay Company relied very heavily on fish at most of its forts. And so the ability to catch fish was the ability to survive through harsh winters and the ability to survive the vagaries of trade. And today, cities like Edmonton are born on the sites of those Hudson's Bay trading posts. And so they owe their existence as commercial settler colonial spaces in part to fish. But we don't attend to those stories and realities very often in our imaginaries and origin stories of cities. So the thing that I learned while living and working in Paulatuk is that my own Métis upbringing, albeit an urban one, had oriented me to duties and obligations to fish, waters, and more than human beings that populate Treaty 6 territory along the North Saskatchewan, Red Deer, Battle, and Athabasca rivers that I spent time on as a child. And this upbringing oriented me to the necessity of thinking about and thinking with fish in the urban context that I am immersed in. I just didn't know how to look for the implicit legal governance and ethical imperatives these relationships with urban fish were imparting to me. Okay, so just throw in a joke. What do you get when you cross an alligator and a running shoe? I don't know, but when you find out, let me know. So, it's really serious up in here. So I turned my attention here to what it means to examine the role of fish pluralities in Treaty 6 territory along the North Saskatchewan River, explicitly applying the things that interlocutors like Andy and Millie Thrasher, Annie Alisiak, Edward and Mabel Rubin taught me about their fish lives, and how fish played and play a role in the conscious and strategic refraction of colonial imaginaries in Paulatuk. I seek here in this talk to tend to my duties and obligations to fish pluralities in Treaty 6 territory in Amiskwaciwâskahikan, drawing on the fleshy experiences of people and fish together. I will explore the potential and possibilities opened up to us if we reimagine or reorient our imaginations towards Edmonton and Alberta and other parts of Canada as fish places, and train our eyes and our minds to thinking of what it means to live up to and embody our duties and obligations to fish we share waterways with. I like pike. So, when I discuss refraction in this piece, this is a metaphor that I borrow from physics, and I use this term to illustrate how Indigenous peoples can and do use Indigenous legal orders to bend and diffuse the state's European-derived legal systems. So when forced to negotiate across both sameness and difference as a matter of survival, refraction is a tool through which to assert Indigenous legal governance traditions while contending with the sometimes unavoidable realities of state imaginaries about how humans should relate to the world around them and what that world actually contains. So I'm just going to make sure that I get that right. So I'm going to quote something directly from my dissertation because I think I got it way better there. So refraction, with its roots in the principled pragmatism that Rosemary Kuptana taught me and I mentioned above, is a concept that can be used alongside commonly used concepts in contemporary decolonial thinking in Canada. I think here of the words resurgence, resentments, reconciliation, refusal, and resilience, which are all currently employed by different scholars to describe different aspects of Indigenous state and Indigenous environmental relationships in Canada. I propose that refraction is a useful metaphor for the ways in which Indigenous actors work within and between legal orders and knowledge systems in order to operate within the layered and embedded structures, institutions, and power relations of ongoing colonialism in Canada. So through refraction, colonial logics are scattered and redirected through Indigenous kinship, stories, cosmologies, in order to maintain local self-determination with regards to human environmental and human-animal relations. So one way in which to apply this refraction is through Dwayne Donald's principles of ethical relationality, which I've already mentioned, his work on Indigenous métissage, and Rosemary Kuptana's principled pragmatism. So I'm definitely not arguing to replace all those other words with my word, but I am arguing that in Politalk, people taught me that they use refraction as a way to sort of contend with the realities they're dealing with, and this resonates with my own experiences as a Métis person working across sameness and difference in order to negotiate my presence as someone with Indigenous ancestry, but also with a settler mom, and trying to understand my duties and obligations within those complex spaces. So Amiskwaciwâskahikan, these are sticklebacks, one of my favorite little fish. He's kind of angry. This is the decolonial stickleback. He's mad. So in the historical sense, Amiskwaciwâskahikan is abundant. This is one of the reasons, though not the only one, I'm sure, that people have been coming to the places where Edmonton now stands since time immemorial, or to get all empirical about it, for at least 8,000 to 10,000 years. So Edmonton is the traditional territory of Cree, Blackfoot, Nakota, Saulteaux, Dene, and Métis peoples, and it has been and continues to be a rich and dynamic place. And today, one way we know of this place is through its Nehiyaweyan place name, Amiskwaciwâskahikan. And so I'll just bracket out for a moment. I am not by any means a practiced Nehiyaweyan language speaker, so everything that I present here is partial, and I'm trying to reconnect with the language that my grandfather grew up speaking, but which wasn't passed on to my dad. And so thank you for your patience as I try to reassert these Nehiyaweyan words into my own vocabulary. So one of the ways that we know of Edmonton as Amiskwaciwâskahikan orients us to two major features of the landscape, the hills and the beavers, Amisk, because Amiskwaciwâskahikan means Beaver Hills House. So I grew up knowing about the role of beavers in the fur trade in shaping the city that my family calls home, and I knew about how this had been a lucrative place for colonial trade. Dwayne Donald, in his work, orients us to this history when he discusses the role of the fort in Edmonton's origin story. The fort, which took several different forms over time, stood always at the edge of the river. And here, as a little girl, I remember we would come to a bend in the river when we went to Fort Edmonton Park, and there would sit a York boat beached on the sandy, grassy banks of the North Saskatchewan. And this, roughly, in your visit to Fort Edmonton Park, is usually the only time that an orientation to the river and the waters is explicitly centered in the entire time that you spend revisiting the history of Edmonton. So I did put a York boat. So there's a York boat, and that's the river that I dream about and missed so dearly in my time in Scotland. So Dwayne Donald has done such a beautiful job articulating the role of the fort in building up and shaping the imaginaries that animate Edmonton today in his own work, advancing philosophies that are grounded deeply in the earth and the loamy soil and the trees and wild roses and Saskatoons of that place. So I want to contribute to his dialogue by taking our eyes along the shores of the North Saskatchewan, away from the hustle and bustle of the roads and streets and bike trails and historical parks, down to the water. So most Edmontonians would be hard-pressed to tell you which fish they share time and space with. This is one of the fish that lives in the North Saskatchewan. Not this particular fish. This is Eric the walleye. But his kin, walleye, do live in the river. And there might be an Eric in there, I don't know. It's a pretty common name. But this is one of the fish that we share space with. And walleye also live out here. For the longest time, I didn't know pickerel and walleye were the same thing, and so I was really confused. And so that's something I've learned by moving to Ontario. So it's good to move around. So Fish are inscrutable in their watery worlds, and since we do not have an active commercial fishery of any large scale along the North Saskatchewan Sipi in Edmonton, the contemporary role of fish in shaping human environmental experiences in the city can be easily overlooked. Many cities, Edmonton and Toronto included, have entombed former waterways that fish ran freely within with concrete and silt and overfill and other technologies and infrastructures that have vastly changed the city-water interface over time. So these places where people came because there were fish have very purposefully erased their relationship to fish and made it difficult for fish to thrive. I'm just thinking of like praying mantises and killing off that which gives you life. And I'll just keep going. So we have to look hard when we're looking for evidence of fish because we've done such a good job of erasing their presence in the city imaginary. We have to dig a little. We have to train our eyes and ears and mind and body to fish worlds that we stand alongside and sometimes even stand on top of. So my dad tells a story of his friend Bobby Lee. So Bobby Lee's family lived along the river, and they had a house sort of below the high-level bridge. And my dad has this memory of being a little kid, and when he would go visit Bobby Lee's family, his family would set lines for suckers right into the North Saskatchewan River. And so there was a time when you could eat the fish out of the river with confidence, when people who needed sustenance could eat the fish out of the river, and those relationships to fish endured even into the 1950s and 60s in my dad's memory. Growing up as a kid, my stepdad is an avid fisherman and a fisheries biologist, and we would go and he would cast off the edge of the river near the bend, near the Quesnel Bridge when we were little, but we didn't eat the fish from the North Saskatchewan by that time. By the 1990s, that wasn't fish that we were willing to eat. My dad also remembers beached fishing boats at Lac St. Anne's, hinting at the past livelihoods of Métis families as fishermen on inland prairie lakes. So as a small child, my introduction to fish worlds came through my parents' tutelage at Baptiste Lake, a small kettle lake 2 hours north of Edmonton and 20 minutes outside of the town of Athabasca, deep in the boreal forest. It is here that I learned to fish and to watch the fish dart about in the shallows along the sandy beach. Here's where I watched curiously and intently as our neighbors cast off from their docks. And here is where I caught my first fish. So my note here is tell the jackfish story, but I'm going to start with the perch story. So the first fish I actually caught was just a tiny little perch. My mom took me out. My dad built boats when I was little, and we had a little rowboat, and my mom took my sister and I out one afternoon, and she took us fishing, and I cast off from the boat, and I caught this tiny little perch. And I remember being so amazed that these things lived in the water just next to us. But the really big fish, the fish that drew me into this obsession with fish and kind of shaped my life irrevocably, was a jackfish that I caught when I was 5. So when I was 5, we'll go back to the jackfish, how about? We'll honor him. So when I was little, my dad and my mom bought my sister and I these little fishing rods, and they actually, my dad sawed them down, so he bought proper adult-sized ones, and then he fit them to us. So we wouldn't get any of those like dinky little toy, like Mickey Mouse ones. There was no way he was going to give that to his kids. So we went to the fishing hole at West Edmonton Mall, and we bought proper lures, and we bought an adult-sized rod and reel and a little tackle box. And then my dad, because he's also a laborer like his father, sawed it down. And so we had these really great fishing rods. And that summer, I was 5 years old, and I spent every day obsessively marching down the dock with my little rubber boots on, and I would cast off right into the weeds, and I would be convinced I caught a fish, and of course I hadn't. And so my parents would have to come running down and untangle the line. And to their credit, they didn't hide the fishing rod. They allowed me to keep trying, and they allowed me to learn through doing it wrong. And days have gone by, and I've been calling fish every day, and they've had to come and get the line out. And one day I marched down that dock, and it was shaking as I marched down there, and I cast off, and there was the plunk of the lure hitting the water, and then there was a bite. And you can tell the difference between when you hit the weeds and you're caught and a fish, because there's like a dynamic pull. And I knew it. I knew I had a fish. I knew I had a really big fish. And so I was trying to reel it in, and it was too big for me because I wasn't very big. And so I just started hollering, like, I've got a fish, I've got a fish, I've got a fish, I've got a fish, I've got a fish. And everybody's like, yeah, we're just going to finish our coffee. And then apparently one of my parents, like, I don't know if it was my mom or my dad, but someone looked out the big picture window and saw this 5-year-old struggling with this fish. And they're like, shh. You know what they said. And so my dad came running out, and so did my mom, and my dad took the rod from me, and he reeled it in for me and scooped it up and put it on the dock and hit its head so that it, would be put out of its misery. And then my mom gutted it and cleaned it, and we had it for lunch. And so my dad likes to tell this story because he's been trying to figure out how I became so obsessed with fish to the point of orienting an entire career around them. And he's decided this is my origin story, and I think he's right. This moment drew me into the waters of Baptiste Lake in a way that can never change. And it drew me into the life worlds of those fish underneath that have lived there. They've done sedimentary studies of the lake, and it's existed for at least 6,400 years, and it's been rich that whole time. And so that fish, in the pursuit of it, in the struggle to get it, and in the eating of it, and now the thinking of it, and the drawing it, and the telling stories about it, it binds me to a particular moment in time, which is a time when that lake was still relatively healthy. And now when I go back, I haven't been back since 2014. I can't really bear to go back to Baptiste Lake now as an adult because the lake has become kind of like a commuting neighborhood for people working in the tar sands. And so they're building, they had a moratorium on building in the 1970s, but they just have ignored it. And they're continuing to build like McMansions on this tiny little kettle lake, and it clearly can't handle it. And so today the lake is plagued by constant blue-green algae outbreaks. And the last time my mom took me there, in the summer of 2014 when I was visiting from Scotland, we just watched the fish jump in this blue-green soup for hours. And I couldn't bear it. It was too awful to consider the impacts that humans were having on this lake and the fish that I'd come to love so much. So, fish stories are more than fanciful ways to spend time, though this is one of their virtues. They also bind us to the waters and lands we move through and inhabit, bringing our lives into direct relationship to fish as people, as stories of their own. So while fish pasts informed stories and legal governance orientations in the province, historically, fish presence and fish futures are uncertain in Alberta. We have watched waterways deteriorate alarmingly over the last few decades. Recent reports indicate a widespread fish crisis in Alberta, one that the government and industry is loath to react to. So what does this mean for fish in Amiskwaciwa-Skyogan? While working in Paulatuk, the late elder Annie Lisiak repeated to me many times throughout the 8 months that I was working there in 2012 that, quote, "You never go hungry in the land if you have fish." And when I first heard this lesson, I kept thinking, well, yeah, Paulatuk is surrounded by water and lakes and ponds and rivers and streams, and it's so rich. And people told stories constantly of times when caribou and other animals had failed to come, but they could still rely on the fish in that area for sustenance. And so I took this as a purely utilitarian teaching. But over time, I began to sort of understand the other meanings that phrase contained. So fish as pluralities ground stories and meaning and legal governance principles while also acting as food and physical sustenance. Without fish, we are left physically and philosophically hungry. So in October 2015, Lauren Fitch, a professional biologist and adjunct professor at the University of Calgary, produced a report entitled "Two Fish, One Fish, No Fish, Alberta's Fish Crisis." And he opens the report with a poem that I'm going to read to you right now. So 2 fish, 1 fish, dead fish, no fish. No grayling or goldeye, something's amiss. This one has a tumor and a rotten fin. There's no home for that one to live in. Say, what a lot of fish there used to be. Where are the fish for my kid and for me? So just as in other parts of the country, as in northern Canada, the presence of fish both paradoxically supported settler colonial expansion into Alberta and acted as a site through which Indigenous peoples asserted and assert their legal orders by telling stories through fish, by reminding people that this place once ran thick with fish. However, today we are at a crisis point, as Fitch points out, at Lac La Biche, which is a community northeast of Edmonton, where the Hudson's Bay Company built a post and pursued an extensive, large-scale fishery from 1798 to 1878. Quote, "The finny wealth of lake whitefish that encouraged settlement has been reduced to a fraction of historical levels," end quote. In an earlier report by Fitch that was released last summer, he also raised the alarm about streams in southern Alberta, where he argues that sedimentation from industry is threatening cutthroat and bull trout spawning. As he points out, farmers, miners, off-highway vehicle users, roughnecks, homeowners, politicians, and a cast of thousands have devastated Alberta's fish populations without ever catching, let alone frying, a single fish. Instead, large numbers of fish, populations of fish, and watersheds of fish were killed through habitat alterations, loss of critical habitats, water withdrawals, and pollution. Alberta's fish have died by 1,000 cuts, not 1,000 hooks, end quote. So there's a lot of focus in conservation politics around the act of fishing as a violation of fish, and we're taught to catch and release to allow the fish to go back. But what we miss in that narrative is that fish die because we screw up the land. With things like the Mount Polly disaster, we see that corporations are allowed to destroy entire watersheds with almost no implication. But when Indigenous fishermen, fish, they are criminalized. And so my friend and colleague, Crystal Fraser, gave a talk at Carleton last week about her own deeply caring and tender relationship to fish in her home territory. And she discussed how her uncle has been charged with buying fish off of a Clecho fisherman in the Northwest Territories. And so people practicing their relationships to fish that stretch to time immemorial are criminalized, while cities who do irrevocable damage to fish habitat and have killed off mass numbers of fish in Alberta and other parts of Canada remain immune to any kind of prosecution. So the way that we consider legal obligations and duties in terms of property and common law and all of the things that we've had imposed upon this place from Europe do not give us the tools to address those levels of habitat destruction. They work to allow people to do great damage with no implication, and they work to criminalize Indigenous peoples who have deeply caring and reciprocal relationships to fish. So this bothers me, and it's something that drives me to continue to think about these things. So what are the state governance responses to these egregious violations of human duties and obligations to fish? Fitch points out in a newspaper interview that he gave last summer in the Calgary Herald that, quote, "Alberta's previous Tory government completed a land use plan for the entire South Saskatchewan River watershed, which includes the Oldman River. Fitch said it barely mentions fish, contains no specific recommendations for their protection, and defers more important decisions to local management bodies." So in other words, basically nothing. So as Alberta faces this death by 1,000 cuts of its once life-sustaining fisheries, we need to turn to different ethical, moral governance paradigms that center fish not as specimens or collateral to massive environmental degradation, but instead as more than human beings whom we share territory and whom we owe duties. Fish have borne witness to and resisted the incredible upheavals of Indigenous livelihoods, laws, language, and lands over the course of the last few centuries. We need the principles of reciprocity, care, tenderness, and trust that are centered in what John Burroughs calls the dynamic but rooted Indigenous legal orders of places like Toronto and Amiskwaciwa-Skyogan. We need to consider that a land without fish is one that will not only leave us physically bereft, but also intellectually and spiritually bereft as well. So we can learn from the hard work. This is where I get a little hopeful. So we can learn from the hard work that Palatukmiut have done to protect the well-being of fish and humans alike in their community in the face of intense colonial and environmental pressures. So in Palatuk, there's a river called the Hornaday River, and it's an incredibly important char fishery for the community. And in the 1960s, the government was intent on developing these economic development plans across the north because it was concerned about northern peoples being reliant on welfare. And so they sent up this guy, Abrahamson, and he did a socioeconomic study of Cape Perry and Tuktoyaktuk. And he came, and it turns out he in turn employed Peter Usher to do the study at Cape Perry. And they came to the conclusion that people in Paulatuk were not getting enough employment out of the Dew Line site at Cape Perry, and so the government needed to do something to make sure there were wage employment opportunities there. And so they had the brilliant idea of, well, there's a lot of fish, so why don't we start a commercial fishery? And there's a note in the report that says, but before we do that, we should do a study. But of course, in like Canadian tradition, they decide to forego that caution, and they develop the commercial fishery anyways. And the fishery opened in 1968, and within a few years, already people in Paulatuk were noticing that the size of the fish in the river had decreased and the number of the fish was decreasing, and they were concerned. And so they were voicing concerns to government agents, telling them, like, we need to close down this fishery. It's violating, the well-being of the fish. And in turn, the government said, no, you're just obviously overfishing. You're breaking the quota. The problem here is you, not us. And so over time, the community keeps trying to articulate this, but the government won't listen. And then in 1984, the Nunavut Final Agreement is signed, and typically the narrative of like co-management is a complicated one. But what's really interesting in Paulatuk is that people in Paulatuk immediately set about using the co-management body to recruit scientists to come and study the fishery and the Hornaday River, and they used the tools available to them in the co-management bodies under the Nunavut Final Agreement land claim to shut down the fishery by 1986. And so they moved very quickly. And in this sort of relationship, what I found really interesting is that they were very consciously applying that principle of what Rosemary Kuptana calls principled pragmatism, negotiating the reality that inviting scientists in brings its own sort of concerns about community needs, but attending to their duties to fish was sort of the central concern and continues to be. And the community continues to monitor the fish on the river through a community monitoring plan that's won awards. And it really challenged my perception of the relationship between Indigenous fisheries and science, because in this case, the community has used science very strategically to assert the principles of their local legal order. So, taking the lessons from Paulatuk that we can use creative strategies to challenge the way the state understands our relationships and duties to fish, I think that we can apply some of these sort of duties of care and reciprocity to our own relationships to fish in urban contexts here in southern Canada. And while the scale of the conflict and the decline of fish in Alberta is very different from the single watershed in Paulatuk, I do think there are many things that people in Alberta can learn from Palatukmut about how to move to protect fish in your own territory. Disrupting or refracting state understandings of human duties to fish and asserting reciprocal and caring principles instead are necessary tools through which to contend with the massive, catastrophic fish losses we are facing in Alberta. We need to start somewhere, and turning our attention to treating fish as kin and more than human persons that we have reciprocal duties to is a necessary step in reorienting our relationships to land, water, space, stories, and time in light of our ongoing colonial imperatives that shape Canadian cities like Edmonton. So I'm just I put a hole, this is a sucker. This is my first attempt at drawing a largemouth bass, which lives in Ottawa, and rainbow smelt, which are really, really tasty. You guys have rainbow trout here as well. You have lampreys. I have this dream of writing a children's book about Larry the lamprey, and he just forgets what he's supposed to eat, and he keeps going to the wrong things, and then someone's like, Larry, this is what you eat. And so, also, I think fish have humor, and we need to remember this. So I'll just, also, I'm single, so I draw Valentine's as fish. So, fish have humor. So I want to return, okay, well I know. Nobody sent me a Valentine this year to draw my own. So, I want to return to the poem story I shared at the beginning of this talk. I've been thinking a lot lately about what it means to inhabit space and time with care and tenderness, what it means to tend to and mobilize communities of care, to embody ethics of care, reciprocity, and kindness in our work. While fish and horses and art may seem disparate, I see them as inherently interconnected. The way that we move through this time, through these cities that we inhabit, are forever and always shaped by the more than human. My grandpa's fervent dreams to own horses and live out his old age with them were not realized. He died at 60. But they were expressed on the walls of those old prairie houses that he lived in. So, a few years ago, I was startled when I noticed a small horse drawn on the wall of my mom's house. And it's just a little sketch of a horse. It's just the head, the muzzle, the ears, and the mane. And it's done with a permanent marker against the cement right by the laundry room. And I realized that at some point when my dad still lived with my mom in that house, he had drawn a horse just like Nimosum. And this simple little sketch drew me into the worlds that my grandpa inhabited as a Red River Métis person, displaced from both the Red River, from his home in Saskatchewan, or his parents' home in Saskatchewan, and from his home in St. Paul des Métis settlement by the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, who decided that they would rather have Quebecois settlers at St. Paul than unruly and unwieldy Métis like us. So when my grandfather later went on to live in Rossdale, along that bend in the river in Péhonan, those stories still flowed through his veins. So that drawing drew me into a time when waters and fish were still abundant and healthy in Alberta, in Amiskwaciwa Sky again. It drew me back to my great-grandfather's birth at Fort Pitt, along the North Saskatchewan, just years before the Northwest Resistance and Batoche, and that simple little sketch contains worlds. And oh, what worlds I hope we leave for the next generation of curious and ferocious granddaughters and grandsons as we reimagine our very existence and our very place here and now.
So we're going to continue this with maybe more of a conversation. We have a mic here, so if you do have a question, can you please speak into the mic just so that people who are watching the streaming can also hear the question, because I think the mics are all going through the system. So thank you so much. Great fish story.
Thanks.
And quite a storyteller. It's always great to have a variety of presentations. Last year we also had very academic talks and presentations. Then we had Hillel Schwartz come, who's this amazing storyteller. And so it's great that we had this kind of vibrancy tonight. I have many questions, as always, because I get to invite you, so I always have lots before you even show up. But I'll maybe just ask one or so before we open it to the floor. Just as an opening question of methodology, you touched on it at the beginning of your lecture, and I know that a lot of my students and a lot of other people who are not anthropologists, who have never maybe lived in a traditional territory, don't understand how to do research in these areas. And when I worked for the Trondequitchin in the Yukon Territory, it was quite an eye-opening experience for me. And in regards to the safeguarding of traditional knowledge and ways of being and just information in general. And that always struck me very brutally because it's the gold rush era and still gold exploration is heavy there. So, there's that history of let's go interview an elder and, find something out. And then, again, a multinational corporation has come in and is mining gold there. So it was a very obvious idea of protection of the mediation between, let's say, a researcher, whether it's someone as an anthropologist or a government worker or industry or an artist. There was these kind of protocols set up. So that made very clear sense for me because of that brute resource extraction. But you were talking about tales and cosmologies and so forth. And I know you do work also in copyright issues and stuff. So can you maybe explain a little bit what you meant there? And when is it, what's the protocol that's going on as you learn all this information, and what is correct to share and not share, and how you make those decisions, and kind of the complicated nature where normally, we just read a book, or we talk to someone and we just quote it for our academic research?
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I think the short answer is what people tell you to do is the right thing. So when you're doing research, there's never any space outside of your position as a citizen with duties to other people's legal orders and nations, and also just people are very aware of the context that research is happening in. It's especially in the north, like research is so intense and so many people want to work there, and so I just took the cues of the elders I was working with, and they would say, record this, don't record that, and I saw that as them asserting their own sort of Inuvialuit legal order, and also contending with how they want their stories to be shared. And I think the very fact that so many stories have been co-opted into European philosophy now as like ontological theory and stuff speaks to exactly why elders need to decide which stories get shared and which don't, precisely because people's philosophies have been poached and turned into these like lucrative industries for other people. So I took the cues of the elders I was working with, and sort of when they wanted to share something, I attended to that, and when something wasn't appropriate for sharing, I also deeply sort of like listened to that as well. And I think that's part of like moving within and across and between legal orders and ethical paradigms, is listening to what people say and just knowing to be respectful of that. So that would be my answer.
I'm sure there are questions out there. So we have a mic? No? Oh, yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. That was really wonderful to hear so many stories as part of the talk. But I was wondering, I have maybe kind of more of a academic question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the term more than human.
Oh.
You use sort of more than human beings and more than human persons, and I was thinking about how, in the context of thinking about these pluralities, like how that's nice because it doesn't really sort of center the human in the way terms like post-human and non-human seem to, but I haven't heard people use this term before, so I was wondering if you could
I don't know how I started using it. It was from someone else. Like I clearly, someone was using it and I liked it as like a way of moving away from the non-human, because non-human just seems really arrogant, like, yeah, you're not human. But like fish are more than human. They're important. So yeah, it's just sort of a choice to center the relationships and to maybe position humans as not quite as important. Because the weird thing about post-humanism is it still somehow seems to center humanism in this weird way. So yeah.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the indigenizing the Anthropocene, which turned me on to Vanessa Watts-Paulus essay, which is unbelievable, and like an instant classic. It feels, which is called Indigenous Place Thought. And what's the rest of the title?
The part I remember is Sky Woman goes on a European tour.
Right. Yeah.
It's a really good paper. Everybody should read it. It should be in all your syllabi. Like, she takes Latour and Haraway to task, and she does it really well.
So it's so warm and generous and easy to read, and it's exquisite. So thank you for the span of thinking in that piece. It's incredible. It's very exciting. The awkwardness of European philosophy for me was really beautifully undermined by these writings. So thank you. I guess the question I had is how do you understand this relationship between killing and loving, or loving and killing, maybe?
Well, I mean, I'll speak to it as a Métis person, so and an urban Métis person. So I think Métis relied very heavily on bison, and our legal orders are formed around a lot of those relationships around how to hunt bison and the captain of the hunt. And I won't pretend that I know these things intimately, but looking at animals as more than human beings with whom we owe reciprocal duties, the reciprocity of care between humans and more than humans, as I've been taught by, Cree thinkers and Métis thinkers and Inuvialuit thinkers and Gwich'in thinkers, is one where those reciprocal duties sort of disrupt the dichotomy that Euro-Western thinking puts between love and killing and thinking of eating animals as an act of violence, when in fact it's disrespectful to reject the offer of an animal when it presents itself to you. And I fear I'm speaking a little too pan-indigenously here, so I'm just, from a Métis perspective, we are deeply indebted to bison and also to fish. And it's why I care so much about fish, because they have given so much to us and allowed us to exist. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think Euro-Western understandings of like animal rights and things like that, I think fundamentally miss this perspective of legal orders and entanglements and reciprocal duties of care, and the fact that we wouldn't exist without animals, because they have given themselves to us as sort of feeble and mostly fairly incompetent beings that continually need to be taught how to work better in the land. So.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and I loved your stories and your drawings. I'm wondering if you can expand on what refraction is. And I was trying, as you were speaking, I was trying to understand more about what it is, and if it's the same or different than resurgence, and maybe if you can speak to that so it's a little clearer for me. I would really
Sure.
appreciate
Well,
it.
it hasn't been tested by my examination committee yet, so in my head it's brilliant, and my students seem to like it, think it's interesting at least. For me, I was struggling to look for a way to explain the way that people in Polytech were consciously using sameness and difference as a strategy and working across it. And so the way that I came to think of it was they were refracting colonial law, and they were refracting it through kinship systems and cosmologies and stories and relationships to place. And so for me, it's a metaphor to be able to explain, for people who can't necessarily in all circumstances completely reject colonial imperatives, because the state imposes itself so heavily and with purpose, those creative ways of diffusing it, the way that light is refracted through glass or through a prism. So taking refraction and diffusion together, it allowed me to sort of envision in a sort of spatio-temporal way the way that these creative strategies were going on in Polytech, and these ways that this tiny hamlet of 350 people shut down DFO and was like, nope, we are not having this commercial fishery. And they did it just so effectively, and it was really impressive, and so it taught me a lot. So yeah, it's being fleshed out as a theory, and maybe the examiners will hate it, but for me it's a way of trying to understand how people are diffusing and shifting and bending colonial imperatives as necessary on the ground and strategically in it as conditions require. So it's not a one size fits all, and I think you would need it alongside all the other R's, because you need all of them to resist the state's kind of dispossession and violence. So.
We had a question down here at the front. Right here. Jillian.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and I wanted to pick up on this thing that you mentioned, this problem of conservation.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess my question out of that is, how do you see this changing? Sort of the rhetoric that says, it's okay, we've conserved sort of this area where we've made a national park, and somehow that's a stand-in for much larger systems that require so much more. So I think maybe your talk just kind of addresses that overall, but could we just maybe expand on that a little?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously I'm still thinking through these things and I'm by no means an expert, but in my mind, so what I came to realize while working in Polytech is that when people were coming to the table and negotiating with the co-management bodies, they weren't negotiating across the oft-cited, like, traditional ecological knowledge versus science paradigm. They were negotiating as sovereign, self-determining peoples representing self-determining fish in internation diplomatic sort of situations, which I think is often lost on the scientists and the policymakers. But if we take it to an indigenous legal order perspective and understand that scientists are being informed by, and see, biologists actually often resist state understandings of fish because, a lot of the biologists I know are fervent outdoors people, love fish, have like this really caring relationship to them, but then are working within the state paradigm of fish as specimen and property, land as property. But I think really being able to reorient that understanding and realizing that when people are coming to the table and negotiating about concerns about land and water and animals and fish and birds and everything, it's actually an act of nation-to-nation diplomacy, and it's a understanding of different imperatives and legal orders informing people's ethical relationships to more than human beings and to one another and to place. And so the problem is that we keep trying to make indigenous knowledge an analog for science or an analog for religion or an analog for so many different things, but it encompasses everything. Indigenous law encompasses legal governance paradigms, it encompasses everything. And so you can't just squeeze it into this sort of scientific kind of framing. People are constantly relating to the places that they know in a plurality of ways. So I don't know if that helps. But yeah.
I know you were involved with Truth and Reconciliation reading with actually one of our grad students this year, Cheyenne, and being a professor at Carleton and so forth, and I know there's a petition at the moment here at the University of Toronto to include a mandatory Indigenous Studies class for arts and science faculty. We're designing a degree here, and we're trying to implement a mandatory Indigenous Studies class here in the Visual Studies program. Do you feel that is important? And if you do, just talking about this issue of how it's all connected and not forcing it in, do you think a program or a strategy like that is a good strategy to have? And if it is, what essential aspects or kind of objectives should something like that have?
Yeah, that's a very timely question. It's difficult to say without seeing how they operate on the ground, but various people have raised concerns about how those might operate. So my friend and colleague Erica Violet Lee has talked about the problems of indigenizing curricula without involving Indigenous peoples. So the fear that I think I have and Erica has and other people have is that universities might use this as sort of like a sleight of hand in the way that like reconciliation is really being framed as a sleight of hand. Like, okay, we'll teach Indigenous courses, but we're not going to actually increase the number of Indigenous students on campus. We're not going to increase the number of Indigenous faculty. We're not going to give faculty the tools to teach like dynamic and like creative Indigenous pedagogies. We're just going to have this mandatory class. And I think so if we are going to go in that direction, it has to be done with like a great deal of care to ensuring that the structural violences of the academy are also addressed simultaneously, and that it's not just another sort of box to check. That being said, I think there's some creative possibilities if it's done well, and if the intent and the funding and the support is there to do meaningful things that address these issues of relationships across Indigenous legal orders and Indigenous art practice and all of these different sort of things that are really exciting and important. But yeah, we have to be careful about that sort of structural reality that it's all too easy for someone to just start teaching Indigenous philosophy, as Erica shows in her work, and just recreate that violence.
Great. The question at the back there.
All right. I was wondering, so you were talking about John Burroughs, and maybe this question can be answered by me reading more John Burroughs, so I apologize if it's laid out there. But you're talking about legal pluralities and how they can shift and inform how we operate as a nation, and I find that notion really interesting, and thinking about that and contextualizing it here, like kind of Indigenous communities having to go through, Aboriginal law and treaty rights and go to the highest levels of the Canadian court system to have their inherent Indigenous laws affirmed, and to have their constitutional support of those Aboriginal laws affirmed, and thinking about, here in Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, here in Wendat, shared territory, and how people are fighting and loving for the health of the water here, and all the fresh water that we have here, and the water walkers who are walking around and praying for the water here, and people who are fighting against like the Line 9 reversal. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but trying to protect the waters here, and I can only imagine how frustrating it is for communities all over Canada to have to go and through these lengthy, hugely expensive court battles, going back up to the Supreme Court, and now the Chippewas of the Thames are going to the Supreme Court again over Line 9. So in envisioning a Canada where legal pluralities work together, and where Indigenous law and Aboriginal laws and treaty rights and Canadian law are all working in conjunction, I just wonder how would that look like to you? Like when it's, sorry to put you on the spot if I'm putting you on the spot, but how would you like to see that look, or maybe some aspects that you would like to see?
Well, I don't want to speak for other Indigenous nations, because Métis are in no position to do that. Mm-hmm. But I think it looks like, again, that willingness, and it's really hopeful, but that willingness to shift structural realities and address structural violence. And I guess I like John's work because he seems so hopeful, even when he's like quite pointedly critiquing things, and his work seems to be infused with so much love. And so what it looks like to me is care and tenderness and thoughtfulness and stories, and just sort of resisting that domination of Indigenous nations. And I want to believe it's possible, but I also see the heavy, the weight of the state when it decides it doesn't want something to happen. And so I want to believe that it's possible for us to live in that shared tenderness and accountability, and have those stories that sort of transcend time. And but I also think that we have to contend with that very serious oppression, and like Trudeau seems to be great, but he's still the head of a nation state that is built on dispossession and violence. And so that tension, we have to somehow address it, and I don't know how we do it. So I do it by telling fish stories, but I don't, I think other people have other powerful sort of tools that they can use, and collectively, if we just start sort of asserting our stories over time, maybe that is enough to help shift the dynamic and disrupt those imaginaries that make Canada what it is right now.
Thanks.
Another question? Yeah, I don't hear. Last guest, Candace Hopkins, was living in New Mexico now, and I'm wondering, as we have these questions always that are so important between the international, global issues and the local, right, on these conversations. And what was the feeling of you going to Scotland to do this kind of research? Or like, what was the perspective of kind of being this expat academic and looking back and studying here? And how was that received, or has that kind of influenced your study by doing it abroad?
Well, I think it was really important to go to Scotland to see how Europeans are addressing these issues, and how people who aren't embedded in these relationships in the land to Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, how they're conceiving of things. And I think that's where it really hit me, that the Academy itself isn't accountable in a lot of ways, that it has continued to mine Indigenous philosophies for sort of tidbits, what Sarah Hunt calls like tidbits, and that discursive violence was really apparent to me when I would sit in rooms and people would be talking about like the ontology of dwelling, but then heavily resistant to anything political about Indigenous peoples. So they wanted to talk about like sentient rocks, but then they didn't want to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people and girls. And so that tension it really solidified me. I think before I was like fairly nonchalant about the state and the academy, and then came out of it like actually quite enraged and pointedly decided I was going to be shouty and I was going to do what I could to tell stories that I grew up with, because I realized that they really just don't care. They really don't care. And as far as they're concerned, Indigenous people are in the past, and Canada was settled benevolently, and Scotland had nothing to do with it, and all the museums full of our stuff, there's lots of Métis stuff there, but stuff of peoples across, the Americas and other parts of the world are there, and it's just this like willful blindness to their colonial violence. So it made me very angry, and I think I needed that so that I could come home and then tend to those duties here with care and love, and realize that I had to do something differently, that I couldn't be complicit anymore.
A question here, and maybe one or so after that, and we'll wrap it up.
Yeah. Thank you again. I wanted to coax maybe another fish story out of you. I was thinking Leanne Simpson also came to town last week, and she shared a great story about the ways in which we learn about the changes of seasons, about a young Anishinaabe Kwe, a girl learning from a squirrel that there is sweetness in the trees in spring, and that is the story of maple syrup. And so just thinking about when you're talking about more than human creatures that we learn from and share landscapes with, and ways to learn about the places we live from them. Yeah, I don't know, I just wanted to ask for another story maybe.
Another story.
Maybe about seasons. I don't know, we're at a change.
I don't really know that much about seasons. I guess I could tell a story. My dad and our relationship is really through Facebook, because he lives on the island now with my sister in Vancouver Island, and the Todds really moved from Edmonton to the coast in the 60s and 70s, and so that's where a lot of my family are now, my Métis family. And so I'll post things about fish, and then my dad will re-narrate the story of the pike. And last night he saw that I was asking questions about whether it was okay to use those photos of my grandfather, and my family of course said yes, but then he posted a video. He often posts videos of his cats. He walks his cats, and he used to walk his cat at Queen Elizabeth Park in Vancouver, and tourists would take pictures. And so my dad's kind of a character, and he's a sort of like now older Métis man that walks his cat, and I really love him. I love him deeply. He's an amazing artist, and he's taught me a lot about the world. And the way that he shows his care is by sharing these stories. And so, and he'll just drop stories like little pearls, like, oh yeah, your great-grandma Caroline, she was friends with Delia Gray, and that's how we understand, like, oh, that's how we're related to the Métis Nation of Alberta. We know the politics of it. So last night he posted a video, and he was frying lingcod, and he just narrated it. It was very spare, it was very short, and he just said, frying lingcod in butter smells just like when I was a little boy and we would catch jackfish. And it made me kind of start to cry, because I wanted nothing more in the world to be on the island with him eating lingcod and talking about fish. So, yeah. So the act of eating fish is really powerful too, and the way we prepare it and the way we eat it, and those memories of frying fish, in inner city Edmonton at a time when Métis people weren't really that welcome in the city. He still manages to spin gold out of times that were maybe not the easiest. So.
Oh! All of a sudden, like 3 hands went up. We just have, I think, time for one more question. Okay, great.
Thank you. That was funny and devastating and hopeful all at the same time. I'm inspired by your continued use of the words duties and obligations. And I was hoping that you could talk about how you're using those, how they differ, and I keep thinking maybe this is the course U of T needs mandated.
Indigenous legal orders. It'll make a lot of Indigenous legal scholars happy. Because, they're all smart, and you should hire them. They're really great. That's a good question. Not being a legal scholar, and maybe not having the best precision in my use of words, duties and obligations are words that I take from the readings of Val Napoleon and John Burroughs and Tracy Lindbergh and others. The way I understand them may not be the way that they mean them to be, but I see them as sort of duties or the acts of reciprocating what we owe to those around us, and obligations are sort of how those duties are embedded in the understandings of how we relate to one another. But I mean, I could be wrong about that. Like, I would not, don't quote me on that one. But I'm seeing them as interrelated. Sort of duties are the act, and obligations are sort of how we frame those acts and what we owe. But I'll get back to you. I can.
As soon as you told one story, like 3 hands went up. So I think we could probably keep doing this, but maybe we'll just wrap it up publicly. Those of you who had questions, I'd encourage you to come up. We'll kind of hang out for a bit. Maybe you can kind of field them just on a one-to-one basis.
Yeah.
Again, thank you so much for coming and speaking here at the program. It was thoroughly enjoyable for me, and I'm sure for many else. So thank you very much, Zoe.
Thank you.